In a trade war, the first casualty is usually the aggressor's balance sheet. Washington fired a warning shot, but Detroit took the bullet. Look at this number, $2.5 billion. That isn't a fine. That isn't capital investment for a new plant. That is the amount Ford's CEO, Jim Farley, had to admit painfully to Congress. That is the cash they are bleeding this year alone. Why? Because of a single signature. When President Trump announced a 50% tariff on Canadian steel, the goal was clear. Protect American jobs, punish Ottawa, and bring manufacturing home. It was a classic political move. But economics doesn't care about politics. The result wasn't a Rust Belt renaissance. The result is Ford hemorrhaging cash every time an F-150 rolls off the line. The result is that Canadian steel didn't disappear. It just went somewhere else. And the most painful result? Detroit is realizing they are no longer the North's only customer. Today, we aren't talking about morality or who is right. We are dissecting a strategic miscalculation. How did a policy designed to make America great again become the most devastating boomerang to hit the U.S. auto industry in 2 decades? This is the steel shockwave. To understand why that $2.5 billion number exists, we have to go back to the moment the trigger was pulled. It started with a reason that sounded reasonable: border security. Citing Canada's failure to curb fentanyl flows, Washington launched the heaviest tariff hammer in modern history, 50% on imported steel and aluminum. On paper, Washington's logic was simple. Canada is dependent on the U.S. If taxes go up, Canada will panic. They will fold. And steel mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio will win big because they no longer face cheap competition. But the market reacted faster than the politicians. Almost immediately after the tariffs hit, Nucor, America's largest steel producer, made a surprise move. They didn't hold prices steady to support domestic automakers. They raised hot-rolled coil prices to $900 a ton. That is a $150 jump in just 2 weeks. Why? Because of ruthless supply and demand. When you remove your biggest competitor with a tariff wall, you create artificial scarcity. And when scarcity happens, the supplier left standing sets the price. Policymakers in D.C. forgot one critical number: 12 million tons. That is the amount of steel Canada supplies to the U.S. industrial chain every single year. You cannot replace 12 million tons of specialized steel overnight. Here is the technical reality that politicians missed. You cannot flip a switch and ask a mill in Alabama to instantly produce the specific alloy used for truck frames. In the auto industry, certifying a new steel grade takes up to 18 months. You have to test for crash safety. You have to calibrate the welding robots. You have to redesign the stamping dies. That is a formula Toronto has refined for 30 years. Washington demanded a switch in 30 days. By mid-July, the physics of the supply chain took over. Rail shipments from Canada stopped. Ford's iconic River Rouge plant began seeing deadly silences on the stamping line. They called this protective tariffs. But to Detroit, it felt more like an internal blockade. Washington thought they were choking Canada. In reality, they were tightening the airway of American industry. And this is where the story shifts from economic tragedy to a cold geopolitical lesson. Normally, the script follows a predictable path. Ottawa sends a delegation to Washington. They lobby. They ask for exemptions. They offer security cooperation in exchange for lower taxes. That is how Canada has always behaved, as the junior partner. But this time, Ottawa chose a different script. There were no begging delegations. Instead, on July 16th, Canada imposed strict quotas on steel from non-FTA nations, and they slapped a 25% duty on Chinese steel. At first glance, it looked like Canada was doing what the U.S. wanted, blocking cheap steel. But look closer. By July 21st, U.S. senators began to panic. Under pressure from dying auto plants, they had to back down. They asked Ottawa to lift what they called the metal blockade. The answer they got was silence. The Prime Minister refused. The message was clear and stark. For decades, the assumption was that Canada needed the U.S. market to survive. But scarcity changes everything. When you hold what the world needs, you don't ask for permission. You set the price. Canada shifted from supplier to gatekeeper. Instead of trying to push steel south at any cost, Ottawa mandated that supply be prioritized for the domestic mandate. Major infrastructure projects were expedited. New pipelines in Alberta, high-density housing projects in Ontario. All federally funded projects were forced to use Canadian steel. They created their own internal demand to absorb the shock. They turned steel from a surplus export into a strategic national asset. And more importantly, they had an escape route ready that Washington never calculated. If the U.S. closes the door, who does Canada sell to? The world is flooded with cheap steel from China and India. So who needs expensive Canadian steel? The answer lies in a core technological difference. Most steel in the world is still made using blast furnaces fired by coal. That process is cheap, but it is incredibly dirty. It emits tons of CO2 for every ton of finished steel. In contrast, Canada quietly bet $1 billion on electric arc furnace technology in Hamilton. This technology doesn't use coal. It uses electricity to melt metal. And in Canada, that electricity doesn't come from coal plants. It comes from Ontario's massive hydro and nuclear grid. The result is steel that is 93% emissions-free. Why does this matter? Because Europe activated its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, in 2026. This is Canada's Green Shield. This EU regulation is a nightmare for American or Chinese steel. If you want to sell dirty steel to Europe, you have to pay a carbon tax of 20 to 30%. That fee wipes out all profit. But Canadian steel, it walks right through the European border with a 0% tax rate. It is completely exempt. But there is a second layer to this. It's called Scope 3 emissions. European automakers like Volkswagen and Mercedes are legally required to lower the carbon footprint of their entire supply chain. They can't just build electric cars. They have to build them with clean materials. If they buy dirty American steel, their carbon score goes up, and they get fined. If they buy Canadian steel, their carbon score goes down. They aren't just buying metal. They are buying regulatory compliance. This isn't just selling raw material anymore. This is selling green credits baked into every bar of steel. The result is a second shock for Washington. Canadian steel isn't sitting in a warehouse. It is flowing across the Atlantic. By May 2025, the share of Canadian steel exports going to the U.S. dropped from 75% to 68%. Global trade flows are being redrawn before our eyes. Canada is no longer America's backyard stockpile. It is becoming an independent green materials power. And the U.S., in trying to isolate its neighbor, has isolated itself from the most critical green supply of the 21st century. But we have to be honest. These macro shifts don't happen on paper or in air-conditioned boardrooms. They happen brutally on the factory floor. Back in Michigan, the picture is bleak. Unemployment has hit 5.4%, the highest in the nation. Car prices have jumped $1,500 to $2,000 per vehicle. The American consumer is paying for this trade war right at the dealership. But the pain goes deeper than just Ford or GM. It is hitting the Tier 2 suppliers. These are the small, family-owned machine shops that make bolts, brackets, and hinges. They operate on razor-thin margins. They can't afford the 50% tariff, and they can't get credit to buy the expensive Nucor steel. Hundreds of these small shops are quietly closing their doors. In Texas, contractors can't find steel pipe to drill for oil. They are cannibalizing old pipelines just to keep projects moving. That is the regression of an entire industry. And across the border, in Windsor or Hamilton, the mood isn't a victory parade either. Look at Kristen Lawton, a fourth-generation Ford worker in Windsor. She calls the atmosphere in the plant a powder keg. Why? Because the North American economy is integrated too deeply. When Detroit sneezes, Windsor still catches a cold. Even though Canada found new markets in Europe, that transition takes time. Certification for European orders takes months. Orders are canceled abruptly in the interim. Shifts are cut during the gap. All of this weighs heavily on working families in Canada. The only difference is hope. In Windsor, they are hurting, but they see a new future with Europe. In Detroit, they only see deadlock and rising prices. The solidarity of the cross-border labor unions, once the backbone of North American auto, has fractured. There is no celebration here. When supply chains snap, The tragedy is that these workers aren't losing their jobs because of poor performance. They are losing their jobs because of a political miscalculation by people who have never stepped foot on a factory floor. The price of geopolitical leverage is always paid in the livelihoods of ordinary people. Canada proved its point. They protected their economic sovereignty, but the scar left on a century-long industrial relationship will not heal easily. Conclusion. So, after all the numbers, the threats, and the billions in damage, what have we learned? President Trump wanted to use tariffs to force submission, but ironically, that pressure became the catalyst that forced Canada to grow up faster. They were forced to become independent. Instead of a dependent neighbor, Washington now faces a global competitor. A competitor that knows its value and knows how to play the international game better than the people who wrote the rules. This isn't just a dispute about steel. It is the moment North America realized a new truth. You cannot isolate a neighbor who holds the keys to your own future. Power in the 21st century isn't about who has the biggest hammer. It's about who holds the irreplaceable links in the global supply chain. And this time, Canada held the link. What do you think about Canada's move? Can Detroit recover from this shock? Or is this the end of the era of cheap American cars? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found value in this analysis, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Make sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive into geopolitical shifts. Thanks for watching. See you next time.